So this is our presentation on a say in my own behaviour and how we can facilitate the inclusion of individuals we support in their own functional behaviour assessment. I'll do a very brief introduction to myself and Katie. Hugh's going to be keeping an eye on the chat, so feel free to ask questions throughout. Some of them we might leave until the end. So I'm Sam Corbett, I'm board certified behaviour analyst and I'm the senior PBS clinician at PBS4.
Hello, hi, I'm Katie Lyons. I'm one of the Positive Behaviour Support Clinicians, also at PBS4.
Yep, we started with a brief introduction to PBS4, and this kind of talks a little bit about why we've worked on this project so heavily in the past couple of years as well. So we've been supporting people for 7 years. We provide supported living, but also some outreach and consultancy support. And we have a very strong focus on clinically led social care. So we have an extremely high ratio of clinicians to people we support, and the clinicians are made up of board certified behaviour analysts, learning disability nurses, and people working towards those professional registrations. And it's really important that every person we support has a named clinician that can become involved as required. And that's not just when things are a bit more difficult, that's about skills development and focusing on the development of those programmes for individuals we're supporting. Many of the people we support have experienced placement breakdowns and hospital admissions, including significant experiences of long-term segregation. We want to look at an alternative. We want to be part of the solution to find those alternative settings that can enable people to live the lives that they want and deserve. And the name PBS4 is about positive behaviour support for the individual, the person we're supporting. So all of the names, so for example, if we were supporting Katie, it'd be PBS4 Katie. And I think that it emphasises the importance of the people we support being involved in their own lives and their own planning. And this is why we've taken on this kind of project, I suppose, to kind of look at alternative ways of involving people in their functional assessments.
Only a slightly mammoth task. So I think I'm not going to talk for a really long time about the importance of inclusion, because I'm assuming I'm preaching to the converted here a little bit. However, I do think it's really important in the fields we generally find ourselves working, adults in social care and supported living. We can work with some individuals who are potentially, there is quite a high risk of challenging behaviour, and also the deadline tends to be yesterday. So there's not always the time to sort of break it down and focus on why we're here, why we do what we do, and how important it is to put the individuals we support right at the centre of what they're doing. I think somewhere we're very, very good amongst the community at PBS is enabling the people we support to develop skills and to increase independence levels, however that might look for them. Obviously, for every individual, that will be completely individualised. And those communication skills and that side of things, we're very, very good at looking at how we can develop the skill side and the functional skill side. What we also need to bear in mind is that enablement is really about ensuring that the person we support has that pivotal role in establishing and developing their own support as well. And that is something that potentially there isn't always the time for in quite the same way. So I think historically there's been quite a significant I'm going to say criticism of PBS and ABA, in that historically we may not have been the best at listening to the individuals we support. And I think moving forward, we are getting much better, and moving forward, that is somewhere we need to keep growing and keep developing and make sure that we are adapting what we do to listen in different ways. Positive behaviour support has a real range of phenomenal tools. Like, we're incredibly lucky. There are some fantastic tools out there for us to access to include the individuals in their support. For the individuals who are able to access it, I think what we need to be focusing on as well is then adapting those tools to potentially make sure we're looking for ways to include those individuals who potentially historically have not had the opportunity to be as involved. The sort of the grounding constructs within PBS, it's inclusion, it's person-centered support, and it's that science of ABA. So actually, when we're combining that person-centered approach with the evidence-based approach that we all love very much, we can make sure that we're including individuals properly at the centre of their care, and that's huge. We talk a lot about rapport building as well, and I know I slightly blasé joked about the deadline being yesterday. A slightly significant impact of that is that the rapport building aspect of support, from our point of view as the professionals coming in, can often be hindered because we don't generally have the time to spend 6 months building up beautiful rapport with an individual. It would be lovely if we did every time. However, because it takes that long time we don't often have, when we do have to rapport build very, very quickly, listening to the individual can be a really key step in that. And actually, if you're telling the individual in whatever communication method suits their need that you're listening and you're putting that individual first, that's a grounding step in rapport building, and that's critical for PBS and inclusion to really be effective. And obviously bringing it right back to the 10 key components of PBS, number 3 there, stakeholder involvement. Again, somewhere we're very good at, and I'll touch on this later when we look at a study by James Breeze in 2020. But actually, stakeholder involvement can often become sort of, well, I think he used the term proxy respondents. So looking at families, professionals, and people close to the individual, rather than necessarily always looking at ways we can be including that individual themselves. Sometimes out of necessity, because we do work in a setting where we work with individuals who've had placement breakdowns, very quick transitions. Those urgent transitions don't always give us the time or the access to make sure we're putting that individual at the beginning, at the center of everything we do. So not at all mine Sam's adoration slide. So there's Greg Hanley has shared a perspective on today's perspective on today's ABA, emphasizing the importance of understanding the preferences of the people we work with and using those to develop preferred learning contexts. And actually it's a really good read. I would really fully recommend that everybody goes and reads it. And it really focuses on listening and really making sure that we are understanding what makes that individual tick. What does that person we're supporting love? What do they hate? What do they want from their lives? What is the aim for them? And if we start bringing everything back to that, we're going to have a much better grounding for a support plan that actually puts that person at the center.
I think it's probably important to add that none of this is a criticism on any other approaches. I think it's always been at the forefront of everyone's mind of how to include people. And I think we've just looked at ways of including the people we're supporting in individualized ways for them as well. I think we talk about person-centered support and person-centered care, and it's another one of those things that has somewhat become a bit of a buzzword. And it's about making sure that these approaches are truly person-centered. So by all means, the tool that we're going to talk about will not be suitable for everyone, but there is the flexibility to adapt them. But how better to include someone truly in person-centered support, but by including them in their own functional behaviour assessment to truly understand why the behaviour is occurring and look at alternative ways to meet that need for the individual. So the first article is, we thought we'd bring it back to some of the research around this, and I will be completely honest, we devised the tool completely for some specific individuals that I was working with at the time, and actually we've reviewed the research following this. What's really nice to see is that the research actually ties in really nicely with the approach we take, so I will put a bit of a caveat there. But this article, Talking Mots and use of Talking Mots with functional assessment, it was a pilot project with 4 children. And they used Talking Mots to gather the children's views on their own challenging behaviour. So that was the things I do, the reinforcers, the things I like, the things that help on a bad day, the de-escalation, and the things that make a bad day. So that's the setting events, the motivating operations, discriminative stimuli, and things that are good for me. So these are the preventative strategies. And the children were able to give an insight into several areas relating to maintenance of challenging behaviour, so ongoing occurrences of challenging behaviour. And they found that some of this information wouldn't have been attainable for other sources or from informants, so circle of support, using traditional methods alone. So they gathered information that was very unique. In some cases, the children provided information that had not been known by teaching staff. Some of the children wanted to add more information to options that were given as well. So expanding, coming down to the detail of those specifics. And I think that's, there's a risk of oversimplifying why behaviours occur and understanding, and actually this is about the individual details for that child and how we can support them. The children will also add to suggestions that have been pre-prepared, and the children will also add to prepared options. So when they talked about challenge behaviours, they were able to be more specific. And I think this is quite interesting, because this is something I know we talk about a lot, is actually talking about behaviours that people engage in isn't often broached. It's quite a sensitive topic and it has to be broached really carefully, but sometimes because of that, it's just avoided. We don't want to talk about incidents because we don't want it to be an antecedent for further incidents. And it becomes a little bit of a circle. And actually the children were able to talk quite freely using the Talking Mots system. Talking Mots is a communication tool that can be used to guide opinion making, to support opinion making, and give individuals the ability to work through different choices and decision making tools. So in relation to what makes a bad day, the information that they provided informs support strategies and de-escalation approach. So they were guiding their own plans, which is fantastic. The results were individual to the child, but there were some common themes across some of the children. So being alone and being told off were reported not to help children, all of the children that completed this. So, you know, to see that those common themes support some of the approach being used. And they were able to give very specific information. So one of the children said, going for a walk was places unhelpful, as it takes a long time to get to places and my feet ache when I walk so far, which I can completely sympathise with. And they were able to give a range of views that presented what results in it or contributes to a bad day and things that help a good day. And these topics were in the Talking Mots were less concrete, but they were able to give some scope. And this is about ensuring people with disabilities having a voice and ensuring that their views are part of the process. And I think it ties in really nicely with other research and some of the work that we've been trying to engage with.
You wrote this down. There was a non-systematic review in 2020 that James Breeze completed, where he reviewed existing literature around how individuals can be included in their own development of positive behaviour support plans. Again, Talking Mots was one of the things that was reviewed, and he found that the evidence-based approach did support the individuals to share their views where communication was potentially a barrier. Talking walls was an interesting one as well, which was one I was personally a lot less familiar with. This was something that Richard and Crane first sort of discussed in 2020, where they used collecting items. It could have been pictures, texts, artifacts, things that meant something to in this case, children, and had them on visible display. And they used that as almost like a choosing selection. What was interesting about this study that I really liked was that it discussed the fact that there were options for directing focus towards preferences and engagement, and historically there's been some really good stuff produced around those areas. And actually where we're moving towards, which is really nice to see, and in the paper that Sam was just talking about, moving towards actually discussing elements of challenging behaviour, which is a difficult conversation to have. I mean, how many of us like talking about things we find upsetting and difficult? It's not easy. But actually the research is going that direction, and that's a really positive step, and it's really exciting to see how we're able to start having those conversations with individuals carefully and in a person-centered way, obviously. And one of the tools that Breeze looked at was the BBAT. So there was a study in 2020 by Davis et al. And they edited the BBAT to make it an accessible version. So they used some simplified language, they used symbols on it, and I believe they turned it more into a questionnaire format, but I might be misleading you there. And it was noted that actually the individuals involved, they reported that they felt empowered and they felt listened to by having the opportunity to reflect on their own behaviour, which is it's a really good starting place. It's what we need to be doing more of, definitely doing more of.
I was having a little chuckle because I completely forgot the keyword, and then we both forgot the keyword. So the first keyword is listen. So some of the barriers for including people in the functional behaviour assessments. So Richards and Crane have identified that some of the existing tools are not necessarily accessible and the usage can be tokenistic. And I will say that is essentially the starting point for us creating the tool. A lot of the tools, they say that they can be used with the individual directly or someone who knows the person well. You know, the tools are adaptable, but I think that they're not, a lot of the tools that I've used are not in a place where if you adapt them, you take away some of the key elements of those tools. And I think it's good to see that they are working on those adapted tools, but it's about how to make that it's truly individualized for the person. Communication abilities. So the individual communication strategies that an individual's using can be a barrier to inclusion, particularly when it becomes to more complex discussions about the functional understanding of behaviours, but also the historical events, talking about things that have happened previously, talking about what happened in those situations, kind of putting yourself back into those scenarios. And that can make it a really difficult conversation, particularly if someone doesn't use vocal communication as their primary form of communication. That's not to say that there aren't options to explore how that can be used. And I think the Talking Mots research is fantastic about emphasising how we can support those conversations and develop those further. But it's a lot of the indirect assessment tools. You know, we're not talking about observations, which should still be definitely incorporated as part of a functional behaviour assessment. We're not talking about that, but actually the indirect tools, the gathering of the information, how can we make that more feasible for people that may have challenges with specific forms of communication? And ultimately, engaging in challenge of behaviour is a communication. It's communicating a need or a functional understanding and an unmet need. And actually, if we can understand that and find ways to help someone communicate in their preferred method of communication, that's going to be a supportive tool in the future. Challenges with terminology. The language in a lot of these tools is quite clinical. And I think it talks about setting events or antecedents and things that are actually, you know, quite technical terms. And you spend a lot of time talking around those tools. I know when I do the interviews, like, you know, I give explanations of what those things mean when I'm working with teams as well. But actually what you end up doing is doing something that takes a lot longer as well. And actually, so it's the terminology needs adapting, but also the time, you need to really be able to spend a good chunk of time working through those. Responses need to be quick and efficient, and we need to support people, find ways that are not time consuming for the people we support. You know, we've already said that talking about quite difficult experiences is quite tough. Let's not drag that on for 5 hours. You know, we want to make those responses quite effective for people. We want to be able to give breaks and pauses where we can. And ultimately, rapport building, it comes back to rapport building. And I think it probably wouldn't be a presentation that I'm giving if I wasn't talking about rapport building repeatedly. If you can support someone to feel listened and heard, ultimately their rapport with whoever's supporting them is going to build from there. If they feel like they've had a say in their own life, ultimately that's going to support rapport building. But we also recognise that it can act as a barrier. Getting to the point of knowing someone well enough to have those more difficult conversations takes a significant period of time. So actually one of the things that we've looked at is a tool that can be used by other people that know the person well as well, so that it's not just a clinician coming in and using these tools, because for us, we're not going to know the person we're working with as well as families or the team members, and we're not always going to be the right person to have those more difficult conversations. So it's about how did we adapt that and enable others to be able to work through these strategies. So this tool, it was developed a few years ago, and it was developed by myself and Hannah Newcomb, who's with PBS UK and probably co-hosting another talk right now. And we developed this, like I said previously, there was a lack of involvement for some of the individuals we were working with, some of the individuals that were able to voice their own opinions quite effectively in lots of ways, but there was a lack of involvement in their own functional assessments. And they were rarely asked about what they understood about incidents that were occurring. And these were quite significant incidents for these individuals that we were working with, and they were having really difficult times. But very frequently it was all looked at kind of the background around that situation, and we really wanted to focus it on helping them to understand the situation, because actually that would effectively support with developing self-management tools as well for those particular individuals we were supporting. So we wanted to use a tool that was adaptable and easy to use, and we kind of just put something together based on the people we were working with. So it was very much individualized, it was very much for some specific individuals. And actually, we've not ended up tweaking it that much, because it's the way that the tool is designed is something that's really flexible, and you can kind of adapt it quite subtly without changing the whole tool. But it's something that we want to continue to evolve, and we want to be able to share and give other people the opportunity. And we wanted it to complement, not replace existing tools. I want to be very clear, this is part of a functional behaviour assessment process. It is in no means saying that we're just going to sit down and have a chat with someone and that's going to inform the functional behaviour assessment. We will, you know, we still recognise that a functional behaviour assessment has to include direct observations. It has to include spending time with the person. And ultimately, that's a key element. But that doesn't take away the need to have someone's voice in this assessment process. And as it evolved, we've also identified the use of it as a review tool. So it's evolving into something that can be used to reflect on a person's support and how that's changing over time and how their needs are changing as well. And it can work as a really effective tool because it's quite straightforward, it's quite colour orientated, and it's quite visual, that actually you can reflect on the previous tool and update it at specific periods of time for that person.
So the tool itself has several different elements, and we'll go through all of the elements in a moment. But what I really want you to keep in mind is that actually the flexibility of this is that not all elements of this tool are going to be appropriate for every individual, and you really can just use the parts that suit that individual. So I'm going to discuss a case study in a little bit where I've had a go at implementing the PCAT with a young man, and actually this part of it I felt was almost too abstract for him. So I'll talk about that later, but just to keep that in mind, that obviously we're not saying that every single part of this is perfect for everybody. So this has been adapted from the Kaplan and Wheeler escalation cycle. Obviously, you've got your clear escalation there. You'll probably have noticed at least one critical change, hopefully, in this escalation cycle, and that is that the recovery stage has been amended. So the picture here isn't showing the dip down below your calm level, if you like, and that was a specific of a focus choice from Sam and Hannah to basically highlight the fact that actually that would have been too abstract, and that because this was designed for specific individuals at that time, that the dip down wasn't a concept that was going to support their understanding of what was happening, so it was changed. If it can be put back in, if that's something that needs it. So it's completely individualized, and obviously for this illustration emojis have been used. This could be changed, particularly if you're working with someone who has done any sort of emotional skills work or even the zones of regulation work and things. Actually, you could use images that reflect more closely work they've done in the past, so that it's very suited for their needs. Again, in another case study in a moment, I'm going to talk about how I'm actually planning to completely flip this on its head and change all the colours, but I'll come to that in a moment.
It's like we're giving you a tool and then saying do what you like with it ultimately.
No, I'm sorry. That's the good thing, right?
So this is one of the adaptations we talked about. So this is being adapted. I won't talk too much because it's a specific adaptation that Hannah's agreed for us to share. But it was for someone who was really familiar with the traffic light concept. So actually it made sense to use that visual. And that's a visual that's really common for lots of people I've supported. It's introduced as quite a lot of emotional regulation work in school settings as well. So if it's something that someone's familiar with, by all means, if it helps them to understand how those processes and those cycles change for a particular person, this bit is about the understanding. This is about helping someone to understand how they may move through particular responses at particular times. So it's just about introducing the topic for a person. So this is the tool, and it's very cropped to make it actually show on the screen. But it's ultimately 4 pages, and each colour has its own page. So it looks a little bit like a workbook, which is quite nice because it makes it easy to dip in and out of. So I think the first time I used it, I think we did it across a significant period of time. The person was doing things that they enjoyed in between. That we'd work through one question, they'd go and do something that they wanted to do, and then go, okay, I'm ready for the next one, and we'd sit down and work through it, and it would be something that they could chip in and add into over time as well. And that's worked really nicely because of the way that it's very visually put forward. The boxes are, so in the kind of, we've used the colours, but obviously that language can be adapted. So what does green look like for you? If someone says, what does being calm look like? That's something that we want to encourage people to work with, using that language that a person's familiar with. But ultimately getting someone to talk about what things they might do at that point. What does it look like? Are they someone who's really smiley? Are they someone who chats lots? All of those things, starting to talk about their own behaviour. And I think it introduced the concept about talking about their own behaviour in those times when things are going okay. And I think it's a nice way to start to open up those discussions. What do you like to do, and how often do you get to do this? So this is about the kind of the things that are really enjoyable for someone, those preferences, and how often they are being done, because I think that's a key question. Can we do anything to support you to stay here? Can we do anything to support you to reduce the chance of things being difficult? And what do your team already do to help? So what are the good things that we're already doing? What can we do to help you? And all of those strategies. And I think there's scope here as well about adding a section as well about what do you do yourself to support your own strategies as well. So that's something to explore. Then you come onto the orange, and I'll let Katie go onto the orange.
So this is or you move on to those sort of early warning signs, when you start to find something difficult, what sort of things might make your day difficult. And actually this is an area, so I am going to jump around a bit, Sam, I'm sorry. So when I come to Henry in a little bit with the case study, he's a young man that I'll give you more context about, but this was an area that actually I was expecting to be a really hard conversation, and I was completely expecting him to shut down and not respond to me at all. But being quite stubborn, I thought I'd give it a try. And actually what I found was he particularly found this a lot easier than talking about when he was calm, which I found really interesting. And I think it was because from his point of view, and I used quite emotive language, things like angry, frustrated, cross, and actually that was easier to identify. But so for him particularly, he found it easier to say, actually, that made me angry, rather than I'm calm, I'm happy, and this is what I like. That just seems slightly more abstract. So something as well that I think is really nice about the flexibility of this tool is actually you don't have to start on green. Give the individual the choice. And actually, when I was then working with Henry, I went through each section, discussed the sort of areas it talked about, loosely talked about it in reference to the previous escalation cycle without the visual, because that would have been too much. And actually he started on orange, I think, then we went to the post-recovery, the blue section, and then he went to red, and then we finished up on green. But actually, even that, it was giving him the control on how we talked about it, and it let us talk about it in his own terms and his own sort of methods, if you like, his own time frame as well. But actually, it's really nice in this section to focus on, what sort of things can make your day difficult, what things can really start to actually be very challenging for you. And when that's happening, what can we do to help you? And like Sam said, again, we can be adding to this. What do you like to do yourself? Is it that actually you want us to leave you alone? Is it that, what things will help you? And it's not just about helping you stop to get to red. How can we help you get back to that calm zone? And how can we help you feel calm and happy again? And also, what can we avoid? What can we avoid to stop it getting there in the first place?
raised a really good point. I think the way that because it's all on separate pages and it's a kind of visual printout, if someone starts talking about something and actually it's more related to a different section, it's a really good visual to help people to understand actually, oh, actually maybe this fits into this section, and you can start to build it with the person. So it might be for some people you might end up with all 4 of them plus the visual out on a table somewhere, and you're just dipping in and out of the different sections. So it can be used as a developmental tool as well as kind of getting people to explore their own options. But yeah, I think I've used it with the visual alongside whilst we're going through it, to come back to it, to kind of point at each section and say, now we're here, you know, this is what's happening in this situation, and talk through those strategies. And the red, so we've also had some criticisms on the red about our choice of font colour. So one of the individuals that Katie's worked with told us that the font wasn't very easy to see, so we will be amending it. The red section, we intentionally left the word blank because I think this is a really important word for people. That word, when someone's having a really difficult time, is very individualized. And I think it's not our place to decide what word someone wants to use for that. I've worked with people that say, you know, some people recognize that, you know, people identify as having their own period of meltdown. Some people say that I'm feeling really angry. Some of the people I've worked with will just say I'm feeling really pissed off. And that's the words that they will use to describe that emotion. And actually, it's important that we're using the language that someone recognises, and that's developed with them. And actually, by talking through, that's why part of the reason the visuals are really important, is you can identify what that word is for the person quite early on, and you can add it in and work through it. But I wouldn't ever recommend deciding that word for a person unless you truly know what that word is. And what makes you, starting it with what makes you feel like that is it opens up that conversation. It takes it away from blame as well. You know, what's resulting, what are those environmental situations that are making you feel like this? And then what does it look like? Okay, so when you feel like this, what does it look like? And how often is this happening for you? And starting to unpick a little bit for this. And then we've talked about the self-management strategies. What could you do when you feel like this? What tools do you have? What tools are you able to use now? What tools do you think you might like to develop? And that's a really nice area to start to explore that. And actually, you know, could you do anything differently? Okay, what are you doing now? What would replace those behaviours? So starting to open up those replacement behaviours for someone. And then could your team do anything? And that's about taking it away from it just being about something the person, to stop them feeling like it's something they're doing wrong, to enable them to understand that this is an approach that we're going to share, and we're going to work through solutions together, and we're going to help find those alternative strategies. We're going to look at those options. And then the recovery section, I'll go to Katie.
So the focus on recovery then. Again, similar sort of questions. How are you feeling after you've been in, again, using the terminology, however they've sort of emphasized that they'd like to speak about things. How do you feel after that? You know, what can we do to help you get back to a calm setting? What can we do to speed up the recovery, if you like? This is one that, again, we have to be very individualized about it. We have to think about the terminology we're using. And actually, when I trialed this with a young man, which was a very eye-opening experience that I enjoyed a lot. Actually, he was a lot of fun to work with. But something he was able to give me very clear examples of times that actually things people had done had got him to the point of being angry, was the word that he preferred, so being really angry, and was able to actually talk me through very, very specific examples and talk about how he felt afterwards, which was phenomenal for this young man. And I think, again, we're getting really much better at including that recovery process and understanding that actually what we do and how we respond to people within that recovery process can really impact whether we support that individual to calm down or re-escalate. And it's something we try and really instill in the team members as well, that actually how we're responding and how we're supporting that individual can impact on everything at that point. But it's also important to have that focus again of what do you need to recover from this incident? How can we help you, and how can you help yourself in that moment? And what's your favorite things to do? You know, asking questions like that. What, you know, when you've had a really tough day, what is your favorite thing to do? We all have our own methods for decompressing after a tough day, and it's no different for the people we're supporting, and actually asking them historically. And it might be that, you know, in the transitions and in those speedy transitions that I know we're all involved with quite regularly, information gets lost, and it might be that actually they can recap a situation from 5-6 years ago when they were in a setting where they felt comfortable, and actually this is what I really like to do in the evening, and it hasn't happened for 6 years. And they, you know, by opening the dialogue and opening those conversations, we're able to get that information, which is key. It's key to somebody's support, really.
I think it's important to recognise that some of the people that would be using this tool will not know the answers to some of these questions. And actually, this is where it comes back to revisiting, because actually that might be your starting point. If someone doesn't know if there's anything they could do differently or their team could do differently when they are feeling a certain way, actually that's your starting point. Let's work with the person to identify some of those and trial it, and kind of work with that person to get some feedback from them. So actually next time you look at this, we go, okay, so last time we weren't really sure about this, but since then we've tried this. How did that work for you? And it kind of opens up that opportunity to start looking at ways that things that can be introduced for someone and start exploring those options. So please, I can see some of the questions are about the templates and things. We've not publicly shared them because it's very much something that we've created. This is the first public conversation we've had about these tools. So we will look to kind of make them a little bit more easy to read, change the font from white to a different colour. But more than happy to look at making them available. So that will, I'll ask PBS UK to share wherever we're putting the tools once we've made them a bit more available. But I think if it is something you're looking to explore with someone, then actually don't be disheartened if they're only able to answer a couple of the boxes, because that gives you an understanding of what their understanding of their own behaviour is as well.
They might also be quite repetitive, because I think something I experienced when I was completing it with Henry was that actually differentiating between maybe the orange and the red was quite complicated, and actually there was a lot of repetition. But then actually that might not be too dissimilar to real life. You know, it's not that we like something vastly different once we get to that peak escalation. So yeah, it's be prepared to unpick it a little bit and revisit as well, I think is important.
Often in support plans, when we come to those crisis responses, do we continue using all of those previous strategies, but you might need to also consider this. So actually it's not that dissimilar to the approaches that we're looking at as well. So I
don't know if we've mentioned, but it's an adaptable tool, and that is a very big benefit. Key advantage of the person-centered assessment tool. It is adaptable, it is individualized, from terminology to colors, which I'm going to come on to in a little bit. And it can really make sure that we're involving the people we support in those discussions, and using preferred communication methods as well. So again, one of the young ladies that we're going to be adapting this tool for, so we haven't done it yet, but it's a planned adaptation which is coming, communicates predominantly through British Sign Language and lip reading. So we're going to have to again make sure that we're assessing the communication stroke, making sure I've got people with me for that conversation who are very proficient in BSL, so that it doesn't rely on my incredibly minimal skills, and making sure that we're set up for that process. It can be revisited later. So again, I know we've said this a few times, but this is not a tool that we need to sit down and complete in one session. You know, this can be through multiple conversations, multiple visits. It can come back, and actually it might be that when you revisit, things change, and it might be that you're working with someone and they look at something that they'd said earlier, but actually I've changed my mind about that. I think we've tried this and I think that's better. So you can revisit it, you can edit it. It's very much a working document. You know, nothing about this is set in gold. It's very easy to pause and come back to, because essentially it's that dialogue, it's that conversation you're having with somebody. It's not something that is hard to sort of reset and start again. You know, if you can take a break, you can take a break from to go and do something that's, you know, away from you, if that's what's needed. You might be the aversive in this situation. So if they need that time away from you, that is fine. You can pause and you can come back to it. And it really supports with recognizing those emotions. And again, it's something we're going to touch on in a minute, although I'm very, very aware of time. We are ramblers. But if you're working with someone, particularly someone who's potentially done that emotional work, that zones of regulation work, then actually it's a tool that really supports with that, and you can use that knowledge and use that understanding to support the process.
Those of you that were listening to Hugh's talk earlier, he apologised for his talking excessively. He's nowhere near the level of myself and Katie. So some of the limitations, it doesn't directly kind of address the functional understanding. But as it is at the moment, it's an effective tool to open up those discussions. And it might be an area for future development about how do we look at kind of what keeps those behaviours happening for someone. I think we somewhat address it with some of the questions, and you can kind of tie it into that. But it's something that it would be good to explore whether there's something that we can work with a little bit more specifically. Our experience is very much individualized, case study related. That's why we talk about the flexibility of the tool. It would be really nice to look at some research with correlating with direct observations and lining up with other tools as well. It's also, we recognize that it's quite text heavy, but that doesn't mean that it has to be. So someone that I've worked with previously, they did actually use sign language and written communication. So actually it was easy to adapt for that person, and they were able to work through, and the wording was able to kind of adapt to very kind of different levels of sign language. So it doesn't have to be word heavy. You could use symbols and pictures and things like that. And it's about guiding the conversation. But we do recognise that it's predominantly a tool for someone who has some comprehensive communication skills in whatever those communication skills are for that person.
So we got there. We got to my case study. So just to give you a little bit of context then around Henry, he's a young man that we've been supporting for quite a few years now. I mean, he's phenomenal. He has had a history of, particularly within our setting, not being open to develop any sort of rapport or relationship with anybody to do with behaviour, to the extent that if you have behaviour in your title, you're not really welcome as a visitor. So when Henry was given to me on my caseload, obviously being a positive behaviour support clinician, I had a slight issue at the step one there, because I wanted to make sure that I was being very honest with Henry about who I was, whilst not immediately shutting down that line of communication that we might be able to develop. I did have the benefit with this young man, and I'm completely going to caveat this, of we had time. So he's a young man that was in the home setting. I had the time to build up the rapport and spend those sessions going to visit him. So part of the really adapting the process for Henry was all around, actually, it took 8 months of rapport building with this young man to get to the point where I could have this conversation. And we had several visits to begin with where he had absolutely no interest in talking to me whatsoever, and I was completely ignored. But that's fine. As I said, I'm rather stubborn, so I keep going back. And I then managed to sort of pique his interest a little bit with some activities that he wanted to do. And really, with the benefit of time, there was 8 months where I could spend sessions without any agenda as far as Henry was concerned. Obviously, covert rapport building was my agenda, but he didn't know that. So without any obvious agenda, getting to know him. And eventually we got to the point where I was able to take the PCAT tool and have that conversation. Now, adaptations that were required within that session were quite person specific, obviously. So the actual session itself started off very general. There was doing a little bit of our macrame activity is something we do together, and he loves to learn a bit of macrame, so we do that together. The next activity is gongs. Now, when I first introduced this tool, he looked at it and was like, no, I'm not interested in that. I don't need to talk about behaviour, which I was expecting, to be fair. So I gave him options. I was like, that's absolutely fine. I can leave it here and you can look over it with mum. I can leave it here and you can decide not to engage in it at all. That's fine. You can throw it in the bin if you want to. Or we can do it together. It's totally up to you. You let me know how you feel. He went and had his dinner, came back, and actually then chose to engage in it with me, which was quite out of the blue, to be honest. And it was just incredible. It's, you know, when you have those sessions where you just leave and you're absolutely buzzing. It was one of those, because he was able to, as I said earlier, give me very specific examples of times that had had made him really quite angry and upset, and he was able to talk about the fact he'd been crying. Again, this is somebody with expressive language skills. There is a lot of masking there, so actually I think the high level of expressive skills does mask the fact that actually the receptive understanding there is a much lower level than his expressive speech. But it was a very low demand situation, and he was able to really engage with it and talk to me, and he gave some of the best answers I think I've ever had. Am I allowed, Sam? Am I allowed? So when we were in the section talking about things that might start making you angry and what do you want your team to do, he looked at me and goes, well, Katie, they can pray for a miracle, which is just the best answer I've ever heard. He did give me slightly more useful strategies after that as well, so that was just shows his amazing sense of humor. But I was able to choose elements of the tool, as I mentioned earlier, that he would most be able to access. So actually I really did feel that the graph of the escalation cycle was too abstract and almost a bit too clinical for him. And actually, given the history of not needing help with his behaviour, thank you very much, bringing in something that looks so obviously associated with behaviour would have been a bit of a stumbling block for him. So it was a really lovely session, and I think it's just to emphasise the fact that actually we do understand I had 8 months to get there, which we do not often have. That is a huge caveat to this case study.
And again, some of the outcomes that I've had as well have been with people that I've spent a bit more time working with to build those relationships. But I think, one of the outcomes of the tool is someone following the use of the tool being able to describe their own behaviour as feeling really red, which that was after one conversation about the tool and dipping in and out. And I think, if someone's able to start labeling those emotions, then that gives us a scope for then starting to look at alternatives as well. And again, someone else that I've worked with using it as a review tool, coming back to it and saying, actually, I don't need to talk about the red section anymore because I don't feel red anymore. And actually it corresponded with the information that we were given, that actually there hadn't been incidents for a significant period of time. So actually it was matching the reality for that person. And it gave us a real opportunity to celebrate and go, yeah, fantastic, this is great. And actually you're doing really well. And those strategies are really working. And actually, those amber strategies those orange strategies are really working for you. So there's been some fantastic outcomes, but like I said, they are very bespoke and very individualized. And I think this is potentially our kind of opening it up to the world and seeing if other people would like to have a go and share some outcomes. So some of the future adaptations. So we've included the zones of regulation, and it's something that we're not experts in by any means. We're expanding our knowledge currently, but I think there's real scope about tying it in with people that have experienced zones of regulation work and working alongside it. And I will just give the second keyword of colours, just because otherwise I'll forget.
One of the areas that we'd really like to look at adapting this as well is we've got a young lady that we're planning on trying this tool with, having a try and see. So she's a young lady we've been supporting for a couple of years on a very high staffing ratio, quite a history of placement breakdowns and a history of the information that comes with her being very much, don't talk about challenging behaviour, don't use this terminology, don't say no. So we've kind of got a big history there of this not being addressed with her. But actually we've got to a place where we feel like the team are doing a phenomenal job with this young lady. Like the rapport they've built with her is incredible. She's really responding to them well. They're managing to implement some beautiful skills development work with this young lady. And one of the things that I think I will be looking at changing, particularly for her, is that actually clearly somewhere in the past somebody has done some zones of regulation work with this young lady, and she's almost identified characters to each zone that she that she relates to. So when she is completely calm, she'll relate it to somebody that's very personal from her history that she really respected and had a really good rapport with. When she's starting to escalate, it's Spider-Man. And when we're at the peak of escalation, she will sort of refer to herself and how she feels as being the Hulk. Now, for obvious reasons, the colours then that we've got will not work because the Hulk is green. So one of the key things we're going to do before we even attempt this with this young lady is swap all the colours around, use the imagery that she is using to talk about her behaviour and make sure it matches what she's experiencing. You know, it'll probably be Spider-Man will be, you know, the active strategies will be red, the peak of escalation is going to be green to match the Hulk. We might keep blue the same. So we'll be able to have that little play with it. We'll be able to look at the terminology, and it's an area that we're going to be moving forward in. Hopefully we'll be able to share some more positive case studies in the future. And as Sam was saying, actually opening up the floor to other people, trialing it across all sorts of individuals with different sort of communication abilities as well, and how we can adapt. We're really at the very start of this project, which is really exciting.
I think we talked about it being very adaptable, and I will repeat that until we are blue in the face. But one of the things that I think is key is the grids. Having those grids and having those specific questions. If you need to change the wording, that's fine, but I think the concept of those questions is what's really helped with this tool, and using that to guide, and have it, you know, things like having it as a workbook, having it as individual sheets. I think they sound quite simple, but for me, they're the bits that have really actually been quite flexible. You know, they've been the bits that have made it successful for the people that I've worked with as well. So whilst there's quite a lot of adaptivity, actually there's some kind of core concepts, and I think what we will look at is developing something as a bit of to go alongside it as a bit of a guide of what we would recommend changing and what we would recommend sticking. But please bear with us on this, because this is, like I said, the first time we've publicly spoken about it. So
great stuff, guys. Thank you very much. You have got a few questions that have come through. Several of them you've answered already, I think, but you mentioned that you would kind of look at the permissions around making the resources available, but one that was a little bit more specific. So I think it was in one of the papers you reviewed, where they had essentially adapted a version of the brief behavioural assessment tool. One of the questions related to did the authors mention whether or not they've made that adapted version available?
To be honest, no, I don't think they did mention that. That doesn't mean it's not available. It's something that I'm more than happy to look into and share with PBS UK to share afterwards if it's available. It didn't specify, because it was a systematic review, and it was one of the discussions in that. So I can certainly look into that.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. I mean, in the meantime, I think it was Abby who asked that one. I'd suggest if it's something that's of particular interest, look and see if it's in the public domain, because certainly the BBAT's made its way into the public domain, and therefore potentially there might be adaptations out there. But I thought really it was the articles that you'd mentioned rather than your own work. The other question, again, quite a sort of a technical question, which is, do you have the Richardson Crane reference for barriers to a routine involvement in the functional analyses?
Katie, I think that one came from you.
Yes, I will pull that up. Hang on. Just looking at the is that something that I can share with you, Hugh, to share afterwards?
Yeah,
I have to go through my notes. Yeah, that's fine. I will share that reference.
If it's easier, because I don't know whether we're sharing the slides or anything, we can share a bit of a references link in with things, if that's easier.
Great stuff. Thanks, guys. We've got lots of questions coming through now, which is good. You've definitely answered it. It links in directly with the zones of regulation. But one of the earlier questions was, where does that colour scheme originally come from?
Traffic, I think, just generally the kind of the traffic light approach, the kind of the PBS colour, you know, PBS colours, without kind of sounding too generic. I think it's the colours that everyone's typically used. There's not a rhyme or reason. They are the colours, and the blue is, like we talked about, the blue hasn't been historically included as much as I would like it to be, but they are the colours that have generally been associated with those different stages within a PBS plan, so we kind of kept it simple.
Yeah, great.
As well, at the sorry, if you look at the Zones of Regulation website by Leah, I might be saying her surname wrong, so I apologise here, Coopers, which is K-U-Y-P-E-R-S. She developed the Zones of Regulation, and she was an OT and an autism resource specialist. So there might be more information on there on why those colours were selected specifically for her individual pupils, and then it expanded from there.
Yeah. And Andrea, you've clarified, not intentionally, they do correspond, but that wasn't an intention. The Zones of Regulation is something we've more recently started to explore and how it links with it. So the tool was actually created before we started exploring the Zones of Regulation work. we've done this a bit backwards, I'm very aware.
Great stuff. Okay. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. What I particularly liked personally was the kind of adaptability, because again, going back to where that originally comes from, which is traffic lights, you know, it's a very abstract concept. So the fact that it's used so highly to support autistic people, you know, it's not always going to be appropriate. And I think it comes back to being person-centered first and foremost, and looking at what the person understands about their own emotional experiences already. Lots of people saying thank you. We've had one more question again for the second keyword.
Oh, it's colours.
Great stuff, thank you. I'm just going to keep on scrolling through the chats for now.
There's also one about the questions being used as a talking mat. That's not an expertise of mine. But I would say that it probably could be adapted, and actually what we found from reviewing the research is actually our questions were quite closely correlated to the research that was using talking mats. If that's something that someone's interested in exploring, please get in touch with us. So if I put my email address in the chat box, if you want to explore that further, then please get in touch.
Great stuff. I can't see any further ones. Someone shared an example of one of their students uses purple to kind of explain how he's feeling, which again, I think kind of links in that point with, you know, being person-centered about this. And there's lots of reasons for that. But, you know, kind of thinking about things like synesthesia, that people might see colours under certain circumstances, therefore that's going to have different meanings for them. But also, I think there's a good point here about kind of developing staff's understanding of emotional states as well, and not kind of pinning a particular label in terms of, you know, this is the person's emotional experience, because actually, exactly as you said, who are we to say this is what the person is experiencing? Lots of stuff coming through from about talking maths, which makes perfect sense. We've got one question asking what we do with the keywords for CEUs. So what should people do with their keywords?
I haven't been given that information.
Don't worry.
So the keywords are for the continuing education units, and they're supported through supporting Positively. And I don't know whether you have to submit those separately onto their website. That's what we had to do last year.
Yeah, so I was going to say, Sam, that I have kind of seen some discussion about this. Basically, for those of you who are collecting the keywords for CEUs, an email is going to go out to everyone who's attended, basically giving you some instructions of how to claim your CEUs. But the key thing for now is just not to forget the words, because you will need them.